Good morning. Welcome to the 2021 Peace History Conference. I'm excited to be here with you guys and to facilitate the women's vision of peace and justice. And this particular panel is about 3 histories of East African women, and totally amazing. My name is Anene Emodi-Onwuka, and I am a second-year PhD student in the History Department at Georgia State University. The 3 phenomenal women who will be presenting today are Dr. Beth Ann Williams from Florida State University, Leslie Whitmire, and Megan Neary, who are both PhD candidates from the History Department at Georgia State University. The first presentation will be from Dr. Williams, who is a recent graduate from the University of Illinois with her PhD in African history. Her research explores the many ways that Tanzanian women use religion to navigate social norms and shift expectations around African womanhood. Her talk represents some early steps into her new project, which she focuses on the work of African women theologians.
Hey everyone, Beth Ann Williams, postdoctoral fellow in religious studies at Florida State University. I'm really happy to be with you all, even virtually, as we try to think together about peace and violence and how to make the world better. So my research, the broader frame of my research is focused in East Africa. So my current project tries to understand how everyday Protestant church women there use religion and spirituality in their kind of gendered negotiations across time. But today, I'm going to talk with you guys a little bit about a new project. So this is all very exploratory. I'm just starting to think about it, but I'm very excited too. So a few topics I think are more complex and controversial as we're trying to think about violence and peace in world history than religion. And Christianity, which is my focus, has certainly been linked across time and place to everything from colonial violence and patriarchy to spiritual resilience and healing and hope. I do think that as we think about peace and violence, we really can't ignore the role of all kinds of religion. So in this presentation in particular, I'm going to introduce you to some Kenyan women who I think are doing really interesting work trying to imagine and write about an African church in which gender equality and human flourishing are possible. So these women are working in contexts that are very patriarchal, both the churches and the societies they're living in, and often in countries that don't have the best record when it comes to gender equality and human rights. So how are they doing this? What can we learn from them? I will say that this presentation in particular, like I said, is exploratory, and it's really based on a few publications, so published materials and writings from these women, and then one interview I was able to do in 2017. But I'm really hoping in the future to be able to go back and do more grounded research on, in churches and in real communities to see if, or if not, some of these visions and stories are making their way into people's lived religious practice. But that's for the future. For today, I'm going to talk really briefly about African women's theology, if you aren't familiar. And then I'm going to talk about the ways that the texts I was looking at are embodied, how they're African, and their use of storytelling, all as things I think we can take away some broader lessons from. So first of all, African women theologians. If you're unfamiliar, if this seems like a weird configuration of words, let me introduce you. They're really amazing intellectuals out there. In terms of public awareness or profile, really the 1980s is when we kind of emerged, and you can't talk about this small collective without talking about this woman here, Mercy Amba Odeoye, She's actually West African. She's Ghanaian. She's not from Kenya. She's really regarded as the foremother of this group, including founding the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, which most of the women I'm reading and thinking about are members of or have participated in. And so I really just want to honor her here. And one of the key, there's a lot of different things going on, and these women have been thinking and writing for several decades now, but really at the core of a lot of the intellectual and advocacy work that they're trying to do is something they call engendering churches. This is actually a very feminist kind of idea, because the principle is it's not about gender equality, gender equity is not about just adding women. They are, I think, usually advocates for women's ordination, for more women in leadership, but the key is why, right? And I think they often argue and claim that taking women seriously, right, that taking women's voices seriously is something that will fundamentally change African Christianity for the good. Right, so they're out there trying to think and imagine and write about what it would mean to have an African church that was more gender equitable, in which women participated deeply, in leadership and in directing policy and priorities, and not just sitting in pews or arranging flowers or whatever it is women have historically done. So this is a pretty radical kind of vision, right? So how are they trying to do it, and by what means and by what authority? So the first thing I want to point out is the way that these women write out of their own lived experiences and experiences of other women on the continent. So really a strong theme in their writing and thinking is that we have to be doing theology, advocacy, policy, right, in response to the lived experiences and realities of oppressed and marginalized people. And for them, that means especially women. In other contexts, it may be other groups. But that we have to start with the lived reality. And this is often a really complex, challenging thing, right? It sounds like a very basic idea, but in practice, it's extremely challenging. So for a lot of these women, right, one of the ways this manifests is that they actually have a very emotionally complex and sometimes contradictory relationship to the churches that they're members of, to the churches that they're trying to write about and speak to. That second quote there is one of many that kind of points towards this, right? That church hasn't been a space that's always honored or dealt well with women or protected them or looked out for them, even as they find it very meaningful or very committed to it. So just wanting to point out here the necessary tension often that comes when we start to dig into thinking about where we're at and how to move into a better future. Another strand, I think, or another aspect of these particular intellectuals and the work they're doing is that they really bring a lot of metaphors and stories about womanly things, right? So they use the language of motherhood, of birthing, of nurturing. And I think one of the lessons I see in this is that the metaphors and the language we use to even talk about and imagine what's happening and where we want to go are really important. And expanding the richness of our language and capacity is a good thing. So I know this is kind of a long quote here. I should have found a shorter one, but the point is that Njoroge, who's a Presbyterian pastor in Kenya and writer, uses the metaphor of labor, right? And she's not pulling that only out of her own experience. She references a couple of Bible passages where they're using the metaphor of a woman groaning in labor. And then she uses that to talk about the way that African women feel in their long kind of struggle and wait for equality within the church. So multiple strands coming together here, but all very interesting. So start where people are, right, with their lived experiences, with their like embodied knowledge, and that's a good starting point always. So that can be individual, thinking about what does it mean for me as a woman to talk about, my faith experience, my lived experience. It can also be cultural or broader, right? So it's very important to this group that they're writing as Africans, right? And this especially a lot has to do with, the colonial past and its connections with Christianity. They're, again, kind of sitting in a really interesting, tough position because a lot of, good early male theologians in Africa did a lot of work to think about what does sort of culturally authentic Christianity look like. And often that was a very patriarchal view, right? So they were looking back to imagined, remembered pre-colonial African religions and saying that, men have always been in leadership in these certain ways and whatever. So the women occupy a really interesting position again here, which I've tried to encapsulate in these two quotes. The top one being a sort of honoring and veneration of African spirituality, and they think and write a lot about the ways that longer cultural and religious patterns of spirituality on the continent are good, are a resource for current day Christians. It shouldn't be just thrown out completely, but also at the same time saying that we don't have to, stay there. We don't have to try to replicate some kind of imagined past. So we need to be moving forward towards justice, towards a better future. So I think that the bigger lesson here, or point of inspiration that I take, is that as we're trying to grapple with our communities and do sort of work of community building, peace building, it is really important to start where we're at, to acknowledge the historical, political, social, issues of the day, concerns, whether that's colonial, racist, economic. We can't ignore those things. And we don't have to stay there, right? We can also offer a vision that moves beyond that, and that looks to a different kind of future. And for these women, a lot of that is embodied in this sort of veneration of, or following of, the example of women. Okay, so in the last strand, I want to talk about a little bit, kind of switches gears, a little bit more concrete, a little bit more in the like nuts and bolts, thinking about how, right? And I think one of the lessons here is that we need to figure out the modes, the sources, the strategies for communication and persuasion that are compelling in the communities we're working in, and lean into those. So one of the big things I see in these women's writings is their use of storytelling. And not just any stories. Sometimes they definitely use their own stories, right? They draw on their own personal experiences as part of their practice, part of their sort of legitimacy. But they also draw extensively on Bible stories, which makes sense. They're writing to, as Christians, to a Christian audience. This is a shared sacred text, a source of authority, and they make good use of it. So they talk a lot about Jesus in particular, right? As Jesus as someone who suffered, Jesus as someone who reached out to the suffering. They write a lot about the many specific interactions he had with women and the lessons we can take away about his kind of gender ideology from those things. They also talk a lot about actual biblical women. We talk about Mary Magdalene as a sort of first evangelist, the one who was the first to see the risen Christ and bring the message. Musubi Kanyoro wrote a whole book, really wonderful book, about doing a study of the book of Ruth with women in her hometown and the ways that that became an opportunity for empathy and imagining the life of that, woman in literature, woman in the Bible, but also a chance for opening new kinds of conversations among themselves, between women there. So storytelling of all kinds is really threaded throughout what they're doing. So I really think that these African women theologians are doing very savvy, very strategic kind of work as they're trying to think about ways to build a more equitable, safe, fulfilling future for Christian women and men across the African continent. I will say their vision is far from being realized, but I still think it's a really valuable resource for people who are trying to think about a better future and to claim a more robust kind of religious identity and belonging, especially for women. So what are some lessons beyond the specific case study? Start where you are, right? Start on the ground, listen first. Don't back away from the tension, the complexity, right? If you're gonna engage with reality, we have to be willing to suffer a little bit. Figure out what captures people's imagination. What are the language and the stories and the memes, the modes, the art that has resonance? Use that. Be attentive to historical context, right? Deal with the issues that are gonna be on people's minds. But we don't have to stay there, right? It's good and valuable also to push people beyond maybe what they've been able to imagine before. So those are my thoughts, such as they are. I also want to leave us just with a few questions. These are mostly for my panel based on the abstracts of the other papers, things I'm really curious to talk to you guys about. What kind of stories and strategies can we think about in the context of community as we try to move past hurt? Are there certain kind of factors or characteristics that position certain individuals as particularly good leaders in this kind of work? Or are there certain kind of spaces or institutions that maybe are especially well positioned to do this kind of bridge building? And how do we then think about encouraging and building those individuals and institutions up? If you're interested in any of this, I'd love to talk about it more. These are the particular sources I referenced here. There's many others as well. And I look forward to talking with you all. Many thanks.
The next presenter is PhD candidate in history, Megan Neary from Georgia State University. She is currently writing her dissertation about transnational women's networking at the 1985 United Nations Third Conference on Women in Nairobi, Kenya. Her main research interest is world history with a focus on women and global social movements.
Hi, everyone. I went a little over my presentation, so I'm just going to hop right into it. In July 1985, Mary Milner McCullough stepped off a plane in Nairobi, Kenya, and into a strange land that didn't feel so strange. With a heart full of anticipation and some nerves about performing, she was an actress in the Street Feet Women's touring company. She and her group made her way into the city center. All along the way, she couldn't help thinking of her African American and Cherokee heritage. With every Black woman she saw, she felt she had seen her before. It hit her that, quote, "This is a Black country. The people are Black and everybody is walking. I don't see any strangers. I see my cousins, my aunts, and the neighbors who live in the deep woods." Mary, maybe more than any other of her companions, felt a profound connection with these strangers. It was not just because of their shared skin color. She also felt connected to them via the African diaspora, a shared sense of heritage, struggle, and activism. Along with a sense of sisterhood, she felt an old rage bubble up, experiencing a great disquiet at the deluge of injustices the United Nations Decade for Women was highlighting. She was very conflicted about how she was feeling, addressing Africa directly as though it could hear her. She wrote in her journal, quote, "It's hard for me to adjust to who you are. I see the pain of your unshed tears, and your hurt drives me to silence. My silence is my pain, and I want to be away from you." So what was happening in Nairobi in 1985 that brought African Cherokee American Mary McCullough such a strange sense of communion, sadness, anger, and hope? She and her acting troupe, the Street Feet Women's Touring Company, were set to perform for the attendees of the United Nations Decade for Women meeting and NGO Forum. In response to the success of the International Women's Year in 1975, the United Nations declared 1976 to 1985 to be a decade for women. Following the initial meeting in Mexico City in 1975, there were further meetings in Copenhagen in 1980, and then Nairobi was the finale in 1985. For 2 weeks in July 1985, women activists from around the world turned the NGO Forum site on the University of Nairobi campus into a transnational feminist contact zone. It provided a space where women could meet, create, and network. Circulating in the workshops, craft displays, performance areas, and even the Caribou Welcome Center. Also, the tree-shaded sidewalks around the campus. Crowds of women in varied styles of clothing and speaking myriad languages buzzed with anticipation, frustration, and hope. The local and the global in this contact zone came together in the interactions of women from local communities in and around Nairobi, the wider African continent and diaspora, and elsewhere in the world. Professor and activist Wangari Maathai often expressed the belief that part of the successful growth of her Green Belt movement was due to the nurturing it received during the Decade for Women. She believed the global women's movement, especially the meeting held in Kenya, fostered a beneficial synergy between environmentalism and women's rights. Despite this, there is so much research still left to be done about the meetings and forums of the United Nations Decade for Women. There were so many expansive, specialized, and tight-knit networks that functioned within this larger space. The connections forged during the lead up to and action of this Nairobi meeting continued into the next decade and enabled thousands of new transnational friendships, organizations, charities, and even government initiatives. Narrowing my research focus to African American and African women's alliances at the Nairobi Third Conference on Women allows us to study African women's local and global political agency, as well as their role in building a global women's movement. It also shows the strength and benefits of global women's networks and what similarities across difference, to borrow from Mogadam, could be found, fostered, and bloom into a global women's movement that would last. Women from across the African continent have a robust tradition of successful organizing and activism, so much so that it's basically impossible in this short presentation to go over all of it or even really a quarter of it. So just know that they had expansive networks within nationalist movements, and they had connected to each other and actually started a transnational women's movement before women's liberation in the 1960s and 70s would be taking place in the United States. As Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya won their independence from Great Britain, African women political leaders organized the East African Women's Seminars and facilitated the All Africa Women's Conference, the AAWC, which later became the Pan-Africans Women Organization, PAWO. In the year leading up to the 1985 Nairobi meeting, the PAWO even held a preparatory meeting to make sure that all of the women of the African continent could get together and be on the same page. The African context of this conference was as vital to its success as its timing as the finale of the United Nations Decade for Women. There's also not much time to go into the history of Kenya here. Just know that when the British colonized Kenya, they, in their process of the acculturation, made sure that women were shut out of the political process. The British were also responsible for kicking off the deforestation of Kenya as they tried to root out the Mau Mau, also known as the Land Freedom Army, the armed liberation struggle in the area. After fighting for independence in 1963, in 1964, Kenya became a de facto one-party republic. In 1978, after 15 years of one-party rule, Daniel Arap Moi was voted in as the next president. Although he was initially seen as a populist, as time went on, his leadership became more and more authoritative. This authority extended its arm into the economy and environment, causing Kenyan women to become concerned with the worsening exploitation of resources by the elite, specifically in regards to deforestation. In response to this, women started meeting within and beyond their communities to discuss these and other issues that seemed to specifically affect women and their role in the community. They formed groups like the Wanyekwa Maramu Women's Group. Professor Wangari Maathai saw the potential of a grassroots women's movement and created the Green Belt movement. Women like Lillian Wanjiru Njehu, mother of contemporary global environmental activist Njoku Njehu, heard Maathai talking at a local meeting about how if the deforestation continued at the rate it was going, soon the country would become a desert. Maathai also famously said, "You don't need a diploma to plant trees." Her message lit a spark in the community, and Lillian encouraged her Anglican Church women's group, the Mothers Union, to join the Greenbelt movement. And this same pattern repeated itself all over Kenya. The Greenbelt movement is just one solid example of how African women's organizing and activism could have local, transnational, and global impact. This movement was evidence that a non-governmental organization could thrive even without stable financial or governmental backing, expand women's political consciousness, and even make a notable environmental impact. They benefited from the tradition of a strong civil society in Kenya and utilized Nairobi's role as a regional center for prominent international organizations to foster a vibrant and vigorous network of local, regional, and international groups. These groups included the Pan-African Greenbelt Movement, grassroots organizing operating together in sisterhood or groups, and various other United Nations organizations dedicated to development, the environment, and women. Organizations like the Greenbelt Movement and their combinations of women's rights and environmentalism made Kenya a perfect place to have this third conference on women. In the years leading up to the 1985 UN Conference and NGO Forum, there was a major push both inside and outside Nairobi, taken up by varying feminist groups and organizations to make sure the attendees of the forum reflected the racial and cultural diversity of the world's women. They wanted to incentivize and sponsor more than just white Western American conservative and liberal feminists to participate in this global event. On this slide, I have a list of some of the African women's organizations that were present and active in planning and participating in the 1985 conference and forum. The Kenyan women's organization, Maendeleo ya Wanawake, played a large role in the planning and preparation for Nairobi 1985. Their president, leading up to the 1985 conference, Jane Keano, wanted to both provide assistance in women's lives while also bringing public attention to their organization, both locally and internationally. Therefore, she pushed to bring the 1985 Decade for Women finale to Kenya. During the conference, she served as an energetic voice for representing Kenyan women's positions on many issues. On the other side of the ocean, More organizing efforts were being put together by African American women, many of whom were inspired to organize and travel by a feeling of solidarity with women of the Global South. They fought for an African American delegation to make its presence known in Nairobi, with a mission to form and strengthen an alliance between them and Third World women of color. The result of their efforts was an African American delegation who attended the Nairobi Forum, 1,300 people strong. Comprised of dozens of organizations, including the African American Institute, the National Black United Front, Passage to Kenya, the Medgar Evers Women's Center, and so many more. A brief interlude in the paper to show one of the many beautiful sketches that was done by the journalists and artists who attended the forum. And this is showing the lawn at the University of Nairobi and the diversity of women who would sit near each other, speak, and even collaborate and create meetings here on the lawn. The African American Institute, or the AAI, was founded in 1953 as a US-based international organization dedicated to, quote, strengthening human capacity of African people and promoting the continent's development through higher education and skills training, convening activities, program implementation, and management. In 1959, 30 women members of the AAI formed the Women's Africa Committee to focus on the relationship between African American and African women. From the beginning, they used travel and transnational networks to achieve their goals. For example, in 1961, the committee proposed a leadership training course for 50 women, 25 African women to come to the US, and 25 African American women to travel to Africa. They hoped the transnational connections forged through travel would improve the perception of Americans, specifically African Americans, in the eyes of Africans. They believed personal relationships could dispel the imagery of Americans as simply paragons of militarism, materialism, and race discrimination. Eventually, the AAIWAC women formed the Women and Africa Development Program. It was these organizations who put together and sponsored an African American women's delegation to go to the 1985 Nairobi Third Conference on Women. For women who were part of larger, not necessarily women-focused activist organizations, it was sometimes more difficult to sell the importance of sending people to participate in Nairobi. Two notable women who traveled as part of the AAI delegation were Nkenge Toure and Loretta Ross, both of whom had done extensive groundwork to ensure the presence and power of African American women at the 1985 conference. Ross and Toure curated and evolved their activism as members of the NBUF. In the early days of the National Black United Front, female members like Ross, Toure, and Jamala Rogers experienced resistance in the form of sexism from the leaders. They struggled to form a women's section, a confrontation which came to a head over the issue of sending a delegation to the 1985 conference. Male leaders exhibited their sexism when they refused to acknowledge the need for a women's section and vehemently resisted Toure and Ross's efforts to send a delegation. At their yearly conference, some men argued that sending a delegation to Nairobi would, quote, be abandoning the Black struggle and blindly following the white feminist movement, and they even booed as the women made their proposal. Despite this resistance, Toure and Ross were able to successfully defend women's rights within the realm of Black nationalist politics and created a women's section to attend the 1985 meeting. In preparation for the conference, Ross and Toure co-founded the International Council of African Women, ICAW, in 1982. It became the primary source of information support and encouragement to African American women to organizing delegations to attend the historic conference. They made a significant contribution to the conference itself by networking with African women from all over the world and presenting a paper on, quote, the presence of African women in America. In reference to the unprecedented numbers of Black women, both African American and African, who attended the Nairobi meeting, Ross said in an interview with Billy Avery in 2005, quote, I like to think that we've played some small role because Nkenge and I spent 5 years going around the country telling Black women that they needed to be there, end quote. Upon returning from the conference, Toure published reflections on her experiences and participation in their newspaper, African Women Rising. They also held a follow-up conference. Tori's extensive observations and thoughtful reflections on the events and impact of the NGO forum are uniquely illustrative of the circulating ideas, debates, and alliances present at this meeting. Another small but still impactful contingent of the AAI delegation was 5 Spelman University women, led by professor and activist Beverly Guy Sheftel. When Beverly Guy Sheftel established the Spelman Women's Research and Resources Center in 1981, a, quote, major component of the program was the development of an interdisciplinary women's studies minor with a special focus on women of African descent. One of their secondary goals was community outreach, and they expanded to an international component which focused on third world women. In pursuit of these aims, Spelman joined together with the Women in African Development program of US-based AAI to send the delegation. The women from Spelman experienced the Nairobi meetings not only as American university women, but as women of color, a marginalized group within the US. The Spelman group attended the meeting with a full tuition scholarship for a Kenya co-ed to attend Spelman during the 1986-1987 school year. This effort to bring a scholarship specifically for an African woman shows that they were trying to physically create the bounds of these networks by bringing people into physical contact with each other and exposing them to new experiences. Compared to the 2 previous meetings, the Nairobi 1985 meeting and forum was attended by a much larger number of women of color, especially from Africa. This included 3,000 Kenyan women, mainly women who bussed in from rural areas, as well as members of nationalist organizations like SWAPO and the women's section of the African National Congress. This deluge of women of color was the direct result of various African and African American women's organizations who worked up to, during, and after the conference to make the most of this temporary global contact zone. Nkinge Tori saw the historic NGO forum as an event that represented, quote, many things for many different women, end quote. Not only was a space created for to transnationally connect women, foster the exchange ideas, experience and learn from other cultures, and experience perhaps the first sense of empowerment and affirmation. It was also, quote, an opportunity to gain deeper insight into oneself, end quote. The first day of the conference, Mary Milliner McCullough was overwhelmed by the impression of a women's space. She wrote, quote, the conference opened today. Women, women. I have never seen so many women in one place in my entire life. The women of the AAI delegation spread out and followed their own itineraries at the conference while maintaining communication and sharing experiences across their group. The AAI sponsored a number of seminars such as Women in Communications, Women in Political Participation, and Women in Business. There are a few subsections of the AAI delegation who were attending the forum and meeting with very specific goals in mind. One of these was made up of 25 women and led by Billy Avery, a representative of the National Black Women's Health Project. This project held workshops and lectures at the conference, and their travels and activities were even captured by documentary filmmaker B. Milway. Avery remembers, quote, the conference was just incredible, and to have it in Kenya and to have those African women with their congas made special for the conference, and to have all the hundreds of workshops in the daily newspapers, end quote. Like McCullough, Avery felt both connected to and wholly separate from the African women she met. In an interview with Loretta Ross in 2005, she shared, we found this women's group out in the rural part of Nairobi, and they raised cows, and we went to spend a whole day with them, dancing, learning about their lives, us telling them about our lives, and learning how different our lives really were. And then not a whole lot that was very similar, that they really lived very different lives from what we had. It made a lot of us more appreciative of our lives. The National Black Women's Health Project carved out their own niche at the forum. They even drew one of the celebrities of the forum, Angela Davis, who was photographed participating in the healthcare and Black women's workshop. Here she is sitting on the lawn And she said, I knew that there would be a large number of Afro-American women here, and I wanted to experience the transformation that takes place when we find ourselves on the African continent. In a sense, we had to come all the way to Africa to understand the absolute importance of coming together ourselves, something that we weren't able to do in the States. African American journalists also had unique experiences at the conference. Donna Washington, a journalist who in 1985 was a medical student and a freelance photographer, got to Nairobi a week early to start observing and networking. Although she learned a lot attending the workshops and performances, the most enlightening experience for her was just meeting and talking with women from all over. Through the women she interacted with, she gained a clearer understanding of the day-to-day reality under conditions where people lack a basic control over their lives. She said the plights of South African women, Nicaraguan women, and refugee women in the US and other places took on another dimension as she met the women who were directly impacted by war, apartheid, and powerlessness on their lives. The main thoroughfare through the University of Nairobi campus featured a quarter-mile walk lined with booths and tables overflowing with information in various languages. It was here that Tori and Ross set up a ICAW communications corner, a place where third world women of color could leave their organizations information, petitions, position papers, etc. Tori was impressed by the, quote, incredible amount of information sharing, end quote, going on throughout the forum. The central location served fruitful to ICAW's goal of expanding and strengthening their information sharing network, as they managed to compile approximately 3,000 names and addresses of third world women of color worldwide. ICAW also participated in the Third World Women of Color Caucus, which was established on site and continued to meet throughout the forum. The two sides of the Transnational Women of Color networking efforts fully came together when Loretta Ross met Wangari Maathai at the conference. It was one of the most memorable encounters for Ross, who remembered, quote, one of the impacts on Kenya has been the explosion of the women's movement. And I mean, Wangari just got the Nobel Prize, end quote. Ross was very aware of the tenuous situation both Maathai and all of Kenya were in when it came to their national government. The Kenyan context of Nairobi 85 could not be ignored, and it brought into stark relief everything the United Nations Decade for Women was trying to organize to change. Ross remembers how, quote, concomitant with Maathai winning the Nobel Peace Prize, government repression by Daniel Arap Moi's government just totally increased, trying to keep down the burgeoning feminism of the women, the gender consciousness of the women, end quote. The United Nations Decade for Women, and specifically the Nairobi meeting in Forum 85, provided an avenue for African women to continue expanding their Pan-African and global networks. By physically bringing together women from all over Africa and the world, the Nairobi Forum and meeting facilitated both the creation of and strengthening of a transnational feminist network. Nairobi 85 was a space where African women activists recognized the commonalities in the hurdles they faced as African women and as women of color. Increased travel and communication technology, which were being fostered vehemently by the forum, allowed African women to bond and discuss what they saw as women's particular struggles, such as land rights, education, financial independence, access to water, and political influence. These African women's alliances then went on to reach out to women of color around the world, forming a particularly strong connection with Third World and African American women. Many of the African American women who attended the 1985 Nairobi conference expanded their activism and networks even more in the following years. After the conference, Nkenge Tori ended up becoming president of the DC chapter of the National Black Women's Health Project, which she learned more about by working and traveling with Avery. And Ross became part of the National Organization for Women, bringing a much needed voice for women of color into the organization. Many of these same women returned to plan and participate in the Beijing meeting 10 years later. The African women visible at the conference also continued on in their work. Maathai went on to grow the Greenbelt movement and ended up facing off directly against Moi's government a few years later over the protection of Nairobi's equivalent to Central Park in New York. And even Lillian Njehu's daughter, Njoke Njehu, Inspired by her mother and Mathai's activism, became a still active and successful global feminist and environmental activist. There's so much more I wish I could tell you about my project. All of this research is going into my dissertation, but I've obviously run out of time, so hopefully you guys have good questions.
Our last presenter on the panel this morning is PhD candidate in history, Leslie Whitmire from Georgia State University. Her research interests includes 20th century East Central African history, pre-modern, transatlantic history, and gender. Her presentation today is a section of her dissertation titled This Woman's Work, Alice Laquena and the Holy Spirit Movements.
Hi, my name is Leslie Whitmire. I'm a PhD candidate at Georgia State University in the History Department, and my presentation is titled Militarization, Masculinity, and Manhood, Challenging Western Notions of Masculinity Through Spiritual Warfare. And just to give you a brief introduction, I'm basically talking about how gendered militarization impacted the Acholi's relationship with the rest of Uganda, but also their relationships with each other, particularly ex-Acholi soldiers' relationships in their own communities, and how that then manifested into the Holy Spirit's movement in the 1980s. The militarization of the Acholi. In Alicia Decker's In Idi Amin's Shadow, Women, Gender, and Militarism in Uganda, she argues that gender analysis reveals a better understanding of Idi Amin's behaviors and women's experiences during military rule. I contend this analysis should extend to other, highly militarized ethno-linguistic communities throughout northern Uganda, such as the Acholi. Like Amin's people, the Mahdi, the Acholi were also targeted by the British colonial administration for forced military service, in addition to low-wage agricultural labor. Once Uganda achieved independence in 1962, military enlistment among Acholi men remained high, particularly during Milton Obote's first term from 1966 to 1971, as he favored soldiers from the north, which in addition to the Acholi also included his own people, the Langi. The favoritism earned many Acholi soldiers high-ranking positions in the military and kept many Acholi soldiers away from their ancestral lands for years, even after Idi Amin's coup in 1971. After Idi Amin's successful coup, he immediately began to replace high-ranking Acholi and Langi soldiers with Mahdi soldiers, as well as others from other ethno-linguistic groups in the West Nile region in northwestern Uganda. Violence against Langi and Acholi people also increased as Amin turned a blind eye to his military's inhumane treatment of Ugandan citizens, with women experiencing the brunt of the violence, of course, but also turned a blind eye towards their violence against Langi and Acholi soldiers. And as such, thousands of Langi and Acholi soldiers were killed in just that few years of Amin's regime. Amin also appointed high-ranking members of the military to important positions within the government. This allowed Amin to exercise complete control over the government, most importantly, the Defense Council, which was Uganda's legislative body at the time. Through the Defense Council, Amin passed the Detention Decree, Armed Forces Decree, and Suspension of Political Activities Decree, which significantly disrupted the lives of countless families, particularly among the Acholi and Langi. And this was basically because those decrees established a police force that was separate from the military for the first time. And the police force had a really heavy presence in northern Uganda. Many former Acholi and Langi who served in the Ugandan military under Obote went into exile in Tanzania and formed a guerrilla group under Obote's leadership during Amin's regime. After an unsuccessful coup attempt, which prompted Amin to retaliate against Tanzania's cities along their shared border. A peace treaty was negotiated between Uganda and Tanzania and Somalia in October of 1972. Following this event, Amin launched a campaign against his perceived enemies in Uganda, which included the Acholi. Increasing state violence forced more Acholi men to flee to Tanzania, many of whom joined Obote once again to form another guerrilla group. In 1979, Obote led his guerrilla group with the aid of the Tanzanian military in a successful coup against Amin's regime. Unfortunately, Uganda soon descended into another violent period during the Bush War. Following Obote's coup, Uganda held presidential elections in 1980, which resulted in Obote's party, Uganda People's Congress, winning by an overwhelming majority. Many citizens felt the elections were rigged and joined guerrilla groups in hopes of overthrowing Obote. One of those groups was current President Yoweri Museveni's National Resistance Army. Once again, Obote recruited soldiers from the north, of course, most of whom were Acholi and Langi, for his Uganda National Liberation Army. After several years of civil war, Brigadier Basilio Alara Okello and General Tito Okello, who were once commanders of the army during Obote's first presidency, led a successful coup and turned Uganda into a military dictatorship for several months. It is important to note that the Okellos are Acholi, and this was the first and only time that an Acholi led the country to this day. Unfortunately, the Okellos' political careers were rife with chaos, and many non-Acholi Ugandans associated the violence with the Acholi identity. After just a few months of the Okello regime, Museveni's NRA seized control of the country in the summer of 1985. In the midst of all the chaos, an unmarried, childless Acholi woman named Alice Auma was possessed by the Christian spirit Laquina, along with 11 less powerful foreign spirits in Gulu, which is in Acholi land in northern Uganda. Alice would, within the next year, become the leader of the Holy Spirit's mobile forces. Now we're going to talk about the juridical crisis that led to the Holy Spirit's mobile forces. Reinhard Koselleck defines a juridical crisis as a decision in the sense of administering justice and judging in a manner properly termed critique. Heike Brand uses this definition to provide context for how Alice created the HSMF in a moment of crisis in northern Uganda. Former Acholi soldiers of the Uganda National Liberation Army returned to Acholi after Museveni's National Resistance Army defeated them at Kitgum and Gulu in northern Uganda in March of 1986. They tried to live as peasants, but found it difficult to adjust to that lifestyle, as their time in the UNLA as well as the UPDA also gave them basically unbridled access to resources, and it gave them the power to steal and, of course, inflict any other kinds of violence that they wanted to as well. So you had at least one generation of Acholi men that came back from the military who had never worked in any other context. Acholi elders attempted to reintegrate these soldiers into Acholi life using Acholi Makon, which is Acholi tradition, but this was ineffective. In Alicia Decker's history of Amin's regime, she provides the context for what she calls gendered militarization in northern Uganda. As stated previously, men in northern Uganda were primarily recruited for military service and migrant labor once the British incorporated Uganda into a protectorate. The British believed men in the north to be tougher than others throughout the country because they were living in extreme poverty. In targeting men from the north, the British militarized certain ethnicities, including the Acholi. After Uganda gained her independence in 1962, Obote continued this practice, which resulted in at least one generation of Acholi men depending on military service for job security. Concurrently, Acholi soldiers spent so much time away from Acholi land that most had not performed the necessary rituals for their transition into adulthood, manhood, and to be qualified for marriage. Much like Idi Amin, their socialization was tied to militarization. As such, their conceptualizations of manhood and masculinity were shaped by the military, or rather modern military practices, instead of the traditions that the Acholi adhered to. Decades of militarism articulated a strong message about the utility of violence. When these former soldiers returned to Acholi land in 1986, chaos ensued as they began attacking peasants and ignoring the traditional laws of the land. Acholi elders blamed the impurity of the Acholi soldiers for the increasing unrest and witchcraft in Acholi. Soldiers that fought in World War I and II, as well as those who had participated in the UNLA and the UPDA, brought sin back to Acholi, which is the name for vengeful spirits of the victims. Particularly, sin is associated with strongly with military death, and basically, once the Acholi belief is once you kill someone, unless you perform the necessary rituals to cleanse yourself, then those spirits will follow you back into Acholi land and thereby wreak havoc. So, Acholi elders believe that modern warfare tactics rendered many of their purification rituals useless. A culture of distrust developed between Acholi soldiers and other Acholi citizens because the soldiers brought sin into Acholi and performed misdeeds while in the army. The increase of sin in Acholi attributed to the increase in witchcraft, which Acholi elders attributed to unnatural deaths, illness, war, and drought. Ultimately, the Acholi felt like they were being punished for the sins of the soldiers. It's important to note that sin is in the spirits. The Acholi also attributed the rise of HIV/AIDS to sin that was brought in mainly from these Acholi soldiers, but also because of the constant conflict in northern Uganda in and around Acholi, which also introduced foreign evil spirits into Acholi land as well. And the main issue when it comes to the elders' inability to perform the necessary rituals to purify these soldiers, the issue was that modern military practices didn't allow for that because of guns, particularly with automatic weapons. You versus hand-to-hand combat, with automatic weapons, you don't know who you're killing because you're firing so many rounds, and therefore you can't perform the rituals because you don't know which spirits to even call out in the first place. In addition to the violence the Acholi experienced because of former soldiers, they were also attacked by the NRA's new battalion, the Federal Democratic Movement of Uganda. Former Acholi soldiers joined the Uganda People's Democratic Army to resist the NRA's presence in Acholi land, as many believed the NRA and the Ugandan government were conspiring to kill all Acholi men. While the UPDA experienced some success in battle, they were unable to defeat the NRA, partially due to a lack of voluntary support from peasants who were also targeted by the UPDA. During this time, the Spirit Laquina possessed Alice Auma and instructed her to form the Holy Spirit's mobile forces by recruiting former Acholi soldiers from the UPDA and UNLA to wage war against evil. And evil, in this case, was thought of as, number one, President Museveni, two, the NRA, and of course, then the Ugandan government, but then also the other purpose of the movement, as far as the external purpose of the movement, was to convert all of Uganda into a Christian nation that followed the preachings of the Pope. And this was because, well, this had a lot to do with Alice Auma being educated by Catholic missionaries, but she was also baptized as an Anglican. Let's see. Lost my spot here. Okay, so during this time, so she was possessed by Laquina, and she started recruiting soldiers for the HSMF. And while doing this, Alice was also able to convince guerrilla groups, smaller guerrilla groups in the area within the UPDA to join the HSMF as well. Most of these soldiers were considered internal strangers in Acholi due to their long military careers in the NRA and the UPDA. So the HSMF also served the purpose of reintegrating and rehabilitating them. In order to join the HSMF, Alice performed a series of rituals rooted in Anglican and Acholi traditions to purify them. Laquina also inspired her to create a ritual that would eliminate sin or the evil spirits from the soldiers and the land. Additionally, Laquina instructed Alice on the rules, the Holy Spirit safety precautions that each soldier had to adhere to in order to protect himself in battle. As this movement did not involve modern weapons, the rules included instructions for prayer, behavioral conduct, and prohibited sex among unmarried people. Though unintentional, these rules were also beneficial for Acholi women, as sexual violence had increased when Acholi soldiers came back to Acholi land once they were kicked out of the military. According to Laquina, any impure sexual liaison would result in a soldier losing God's protection, which was their only armor in battle against the NRA. The juridical crisis in Acholi was both an external and internal issue. On one hand, Museveni and the NRA were responsible for the external threat to the Acholi, specifically Acholi men, by targeting them through violent means. However, the Acholi soldiers were also viewed as an internal threat within Acholi land because of their capacity for violence and their failure to perform the necessary rituals to rid them of evil spirits. Alice Laquina's leadership, which was legitimized by her spirit mediumship, which for the purpose of time, I didn't cover that. But her leadership was legitimized by her spirit mediumship, and her leadership addressed both the internal and external threats to the Acholi through the incorporation of traditional and Christian rituals. Most significantly, Alice used the Holy Spirit safety precautions and purifying rituals to challenge these soldiers' utilization of violence, physical violence, and sexual violence as a signifier of masculinity and manhood. In October 1987, the HSMF successfully battled in Lira, Soroti, and Mbale, which are all in northern Uganda, and Tororo, to Busoga, before the National Resistance Army defeated them. Alice and some of her followers fled to Kenya, where she remained until her death in the early 2000s, actually. And basically, of course, this issue is still a big issue as far as gendered militarization and the impact of that on relations between the Acholi, but also between the Acholi and the Ugandan government. There's still a lot of distrust among other ethno-linguistic groups, particularly that aren't within northern Uganda of the Acholi because of their long military history, or rather their careers within the military. But also, of course, sexual violence is still, a huge issue in Acholi land as well. And this is in many ways attributed to militarization. Thank you.
As I listened to all the wonderful, amazing presentations of the African women and African American women that were mentioned were absolutely phenomenal, and they pushed through patriarchy, masculinity, gender inequality, violence of all sorts with their strength, resilience, grace, and women like Alice Laquina, Mercy Odoyeye, and Mary McCullough were unapologetic while doing it. For our Q&A session, we will have enough time to ask Dr. Williams and PhD candidate Leslie Whitmire 2 questions. My first question is for PhD candidate Leslie Whitmire. In your presentation, you mentioned how unruly and violent the soldiers were and how they were causing so many issues. How was it that some of them began to follow Alice Ayuma? What was it that drew them to believe in her ability to save them? With her being a woman in a country where gender equality was not practiced.
That is a really good question, and it is also the the subject that I'm covering for the first chapter of my dissertation. And so it is really complex. Of course, it's really big, but I'm going to try to condense this into just a few minutes or what have you. The long and the short of it is the reason why these ex-soldiers were so willing to engage Alice Laquina, but also to follow her as their leader. It had a lot to do with the connections that the Acholi have traditionally had to spirit mediumship and the significance of the practice in not just among the Acholi, but in East Africa in general, and the particular kind of spirit mediumship that the Acholi practiced was based on a tradition out of the Shwezi Empire, which was actually a very significant empire in East Africa, but that is very rarely spoken of. Usually, particularly within this region, you talk about either Ethiopia, Kenya, or Bagandan kingdoms. or Ugandan kingdoms, which it would be Baganda. But this was actually a dynasty, or rather an empire based on a dynasty that went back for centuries, upon centuries before the start of colonization in Africa. And spirit mediumship was very integral to not just their spiritual practices, but their actual origin story, their creationist myths, and also the creationist myth for the family that supposedly originally started the dynasty. So there's a very long tradition of spirit mediumship that basically gives women, because spirit mediums, even within the Shwezi dynasty, they traditionally predominantly been women. Really up until colonization, the vast majority of them were women. And the belief system is basically that not only are spirit mediums actually mediums for specific spirits, but they also have other roles in society as well that are very important. One, they were responsible in a lot of places for performing specific rituals that were tied to cleansing soldiers after battle. And that's still something that is practiced among several ethno-linguistic groups in East Africa today, the Acholi included. And they also acted as basically doulas in a lot of places, including in Choli land. So basically, they were always associated with motherhood, fertility, and regenerativity. But they also, women were able to establish important roles in society because of their status as spirit mediums. Of course, not all women were spirit mediums, but those that were able to establish themselves as having some kind of higher social ranking in society. And that particular thing diminished as colonization took root in East Africa, because basically, long story short, men got involved because that was the only way that a lot of men could access power, because of colonizers centralizing power through the state. So, but as it relates to what is happening during the 80s, during the movement, Alice Laquina was able to tap into traditional spirit medium rituals that are tied to the Shwezi Empire. And particularly in cleansing the soldiers. And So one, she was able to actually cleanse them of the spirits that were supposed to be attached to them, that their elders had blamed them for bringing into Acholi land. But also, and I think this was particularly unique to her at that time, she was able to give them, for lack of better words, purpose. There are a lot of soldiers, actually, even at that time, that were complaining that when they tried to reintegrate back into Acholi society, even if they, went through these rituals with their elders, they still didn't feel acceptance. And that's still something that's common among ex-soldiers of the Lord's Resistance Army, with those who have actually escaped and tried to reintegrate, particularly those who were child soldiers. They're still expressing that they're having issue with, one, reintegrating, but also finding something for them to do because the opportunities aren't there, because the communities don't trust them. And Alice offered them both, because not only did she cleanse them and make them basically acceptable to their communities, but she also gave them a direction. And she gave them a purpose that connected them to their traditional values in the first place, while not trying to completely divorce them from the values that modern militarism had instilled in them as well.
My next and final question for our panelist is for Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams, in your presentation, you mentioned that the women's visions are far from being realized. Do you think there is a more stronger presence of patriarchy since these women are peacefully trying to engender churches? Could this be a part of the reason that their vision was not being realized? What are your thoughts?
Thank you for that really interesting question about whether women theologians may have pushed patriarchy further in their communities through a more aggressive set of tactics. I mean, counterfactuals are always hard to answer. I'm sure we can look at particular instances or moments where we could argue one way or another that a more divisive or decisive action would have produced better results. I think the really important thing to remember, though, at least from my understanding of these women and their goals and priorities thus far, is that they're very committed to pursuing justice and gender equality in community, right? So they're not looking to break a system or tear it down as much as they're looking to change it from within. And I think we all can understand pretty intuitively that that's actually a much slower, harder thing, right? So they want gender equality, they want justice and equity, but it's not their only priority. They have other things they care about. They're theologians, they're professionally and personally and spiritually invested in pursuit of truth and in spirituality, in the same way that they're want to see change in their communities. They're also enmeshed in and part of their churches, their cultures, their families. So yeah, my interpretation at this moment, at least, is that they're playing a long game, and I think it's a very strategic one. Only time will tell the answer to your question.
This concludes our Women's Visions of Peace and Justice. Thank you to Dr. Williams and PhD candidates Leslie Whitmire and Megan Neary. Your research presentations were informative, engaging, and very important. It was amazing to facilitate this wonderful panel today with all of you, including our virtual audience. As I reflect on the research presentation today, I can't help but say that it is important to always involve and include women in local, national, and global history. Their voices and experiences matter, and they are valid and extremely important. We all look forward to meeting again next year for another Peace History Conference. Stay well, stay blessed. Thank you.